They were the architects of nightmares, men who held the power of life and death over millions. They built empires of fear and monuments to their own egos, believing they were untouchable. For a time, they seemed more than mortal, commanding armies, dominating nations, and rewriting history in their own image. Their names alone, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Gaddafi, still conjure images of absolute terrifying power. But what happens when absolute power meets an absolute end? What's the final chapter for those who think they'll rule forever? From lavish beds to drainage pipes, from a hail of bullets to a hangman's noose, the final moments of the world's most infamous dictators are often as brutal and shocking as their lives. So, how did these men who acted like gods finally meet their mortal end? 1. The archetype of tyranny, Adolf Hitler. We start with perhaps the most infamous dictator of all, Adolf Hitler. As the Führer of Nazi Germany, his ambition plunged the world into its deadliest conflict and orchestrated the Holocaust. His regime was directly responsible for the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. In total, the war he unleashed led to the deaths of an estimated 70 to 85 million people. But by April 1945, his 1,000-year Reich was down to its final days. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin, its artillery turning the capital of his empire to dust. Trapped 50 feet underground in his Führer bunker, Hitler was a shadow of his former self, stooped, trembling, and consumed by paranoia. He raged against his generals, finally admitting the war was lost. In those final, surreal hours, he married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. He dictated his last political testament, a final, unrepentant rant that blamed the very people he had persecuted for the war he started. Then he prepared for the end. He even had his beloved dog, Blondie, poisoned to test the cyanide capsules. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun said their farewells. They retreated to their private quarters. Witnesses heard a tense silence, then the sharp crack of a single gunshot. Hitler, the man who had set a continent on fire, had died by his own hand. At 56 years old, he had bitten into a cyanide capsule and shot himself in the head. Eva Braun lay beside him, dead from poison alone. Following his last orders, their bodies were carried up to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, doused with gasoline, and set ablaze as Soviet shells exploded around them. The architect of ruin was reduced to charred remains, a pathetic end for a man who demanded the world kneel before him. 2. The humiliating end, Benito Mussolini. Just 2 days before Hitler took his own life, his mentor in fascism, Benito Mussolini, met an equally humiliating, but far more public end. Italy's Il Duce had promised to restore the glory of the Roman Empire. Instead, he led his nation to ruin as Hitler's junior partner. By April 1945, Mussolini's puppet state was collapsing. Disguised in a German military coat, he tried to flee to Switzerland with his mistress, Clara Petacci. But there was no escape. Near Lake Como, partisan fighters stopped their convoy. Despite the disguise, the most recognizable face in Italy was quickly found out. Mussolini and Petacci were captured. The next day, April 28th, a partisan commander arrived with orders. There would be no trial. They were driven to the gate of a quiet villa, pushed onto the road and executed with a submachine gun. Mussolini, the once bombastic orator, was dead at 61. But his humiliation wasn't over. The bodies were driven to Milan and dumped in a public square called Piazzale Loreto, the same place where fascists had executed 15 partisans months earlier. An enraged mob descended on the corpses, kicking and spitting on the remains. Finally, in an act of ultimate degradation, their bodies were strung up by their heels from the girder of a gas station, a grotesque spectacle for all to see. The man who would be Caesar ended his life as a public display of failure and hatred. 3. The modern tyrant's fate, Saddam Hussein. Decades later, the fall of a modern dictator could be broadcast to the world in real time. Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq for over 20 years with an iron fist. He was responsible for the deaths of up to 1 million people through brutal wars, genocidal campaigns, and the torture of political opponents. His end began with the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Baghdad fell quickly, but Saddam vanished. For months, he was the world's most wanted man. He wasn't found in a palace, but in a cramped, filthy hole in the ground near his hometown of Tikrit. A spider hole, as his captors called it. The all-powerful leader was gone. In his place was a disheveled, bearded man who surrendered without a fight. The trial that followed was a chaotic spectacle. Saddam was defiant, yelling at the judges and claiming it was all a sham. In November 2006, he was found guilty of crimes against humanity for the 1982 massacre of 148 Shiite men and boys and sentenced to death.
قررت المحكمة الحكم على المدان صدام حسين المجيد بالإعدام شنقا حتى الموت لارتكاب قتل عمد كجريمة ضد الإنسانية وفق المادة 12 أولا.
In the pre-dawn hours of December 30th, 2006, Saddam was led to the gallows. What was meant to be a state-sanctioned execution descended into a taunting spectacle. As the noose was placed around his neck, guards jeered his name. The entire event was secretly filmed on a cell phone and leaked to the world. In the grainy video, Saddam appears calm, trading insults with his executioners before reciting a final prayer. The trapdoor opened. At 69 years old, the dictator's life ended with the snap of his neck, a brutal end captured for the entire world to witness. The ways these men met their end are as varied as they are grim. If you find these deep dives into history compelling and want to see more, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We release new videos on the most fascinating parts of our past every week. 4. The architect of the gulags, Joseph Stalin. Some dictators are consumed by the violence they create. Others die in a way that perfectly reflects the paranoia of their rule. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet man of steel, was responsible for the deaths of millions. Modern estimates range from 6 to 20 million, or even higher, from purges, famines, and the vast network of gulag labor camps. He governed through absolute terror, where even his closest allies lived in fear. It was this very terror that sealed his fate. On the night of March 1st, 1953, the 74-year-old Stalin retired to his quarters. The next morning, his guards grew worried. They had strict orders never to disturb him, but hours passed with no sound. Late that evening, they finally entered and found him on the floor, conscious but unable to speak, soaked in his own urine. He'd had a massive stroke. And here, the great irony of his rule became his death sentence. His terrified underlings were paralyzed by fear. Instead of immediately calling for the best doctors, they hesitated for hours, terrified of making a wrong move. Some historians even think medical aid was deliberately delayed. When doctors were finally called, they too were terrified. For 4 days, Stalin agonized. He was helpless, a prisoner in his own dying body, surrounded by men who were perhaps more afraid of him surviving than of him dying. He finally expired on the evening of March 5th, 1953. In the end, the system of absolute fear that Stalin had perfected became the instrument of his own pathetic, undignified death. 5. Captured on camera, Muammar Gaddafi. If Saddam's execution went viral, Muammar Gaddafi's death was practically live-streamed by a mob. The flamboyant and vicious ruler of Libya for 42 years, Gaddafi's reign was a bizarre mix of pan-African rhetoric and ruthless oppression. In 2011, the Arab Spring swept through Libya. An uprising, backed by NATO airstrikes, escalated into a full-blown civil war. Gaddafi, who once boasted his people would die for him, found himself on the run. He made a last stand in his hometown of Sirte. On October 20th, 2011, his end came. A NATO airstrike hit his convoy. Gaddafi, wounded but alive, crawled from the wreckage and hid in a concrete drainage pipe. It was there that rebel fighters found him. What happened next was captured on a dozen cell phone cameras. The videos are chaotic, blurry, and brutal. They show a bloodied and disoriented Gaddafi being dragged from the pipe. He's manhandled, beaten, and stabbed by a frenzied mob. In one video, he can be heard pleading, "What did I do wrong?" The 69-year-old dictator was executed shortly after his capture. His body was taken to the city of Misrata and, in a final act of humiliation, displayed for days in a commercial meat freezer where Libyans lined up to see for themselves that the tyrant was truly dead. From a palace to a drainage pipe to a freezer, Gaddafi's final hours were a violent spectacle for the modern age. 6. The killing field's creator, Pol Pot. Some deaths are public spectacles, others are shrouded in mystery, leaving the world to wonder if justice was ever served. Such was the end of Pol Pot, the leader of Cambodia's Khmer Rouge. Between 1975 and 1979, his fanatical regime tried to create a pure agrarian utopia. This twisted vision led to one of the 20th century's worst genocides. An estimated 2 million people, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population, died from execution, starvation, and forced labor in the killing fields. Forced from power in 1979, Pol Pot and his followers retreated into the jungle, where they waged a guerrilla war for decades. He was the ghost of Cambodia, a spectre of evil who had seemingly vanished. His end came not from an international court, but from his own fracturing movement. In 1997, Pol Pot was purged by his former comrades, put through a show trial in the jungle, and sentenced to life under house arrest. On April 15th, 1998, just as it seemed he might be handed over to face real justice, news broke that the 73-year-old was dead. The official cause was a heart attack. But the timing has always been deeply suspicious. Many believe he committed suicide to avoid a trial for his crimes. His body was hastily cremated on a pile of old tires in the jungle, leaving behind nothing but questions and the enduring pain of a nation he destroyed. 7. The Untouchables. Franco, Pinochet, and Idi Amin. There's a grim expectation that men who live by the sword will die by the sword, but history shows that's often not the case. In a final, frustrating twist, many of the world's worst tyrants escape justice entirely, dying peacefully in old age. Take Francisco Franco of Spain. He ruled for nearly 4 decades, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands. He didn't die in a bunker or at the hands of partisans. He died of heart failure in a Madrid hospital in 1975 at the age of 82. Consider Augusto Pinochet of Chile. His 17-year regime was marked by the torture and murder of thousands. Yet, after years of dodging conviction by citing ill health, Pinochet died of a heart attack in a Santiago hospital in 2006. He was 91. And then there's Idi Amin, the butcher of Uganda. His 8-year rule left up to 500,000 people dead. When he was overthrown, he fled into comfortable exile in Saudi Arabia. He died there in 2003 from kidney failure at the age of 78. For these men, there was no dramatic final act of retribution, only the quiet, unremarkable end of a long life, a chilling testament to the world's failure to hold absolute power to account. 8. The great helmsman's last breath, Mao Zedong. Finally, we turn to the man responsible for more deaths than any other leader in history, Mao Zedong. As founder of the People's Republic of China, his political campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution led to the deaths of an estimated 45 to 70 million people through starvation, persecution, and forced labor. Unlike many others on this list, Mao's power was never truly challenged. He ruled China until his death, but his final years were a slow, secretive decline. A lifetime of heavy smoking had ruined his health, and a degenerative disease left him immobile and his speech slurred. His last public appearance was in May 1976. After that, the great helmsman was hidden from view. He suffered a series of heart attacks, each worse than the last. On September 9th, 1976, Mao Zedong died at the age of 82. The official announcement was delayed for 16 hours. He died, not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet fade, leaving a power vacuum and a catastrophic legacy that China grapples with to this day. So what can we learn from these final moments? The ends of dictators are as varied as their reigns of terror. Some are torn apart by the very people they oppressed. Their deaths a brutal public release. Some turn their own weapons on themselves. And some, perhaps most chillingly, simply fade away, dying of old age, untouched by earthly justice. Their stories are a stark reminder that even for those who achieve godlike power, the end is inevitable. Absolute power is always temporary, and the way they die, whether it's violent, pathetic, or peaceful, often serves as a final, ironic commentary on the way they ruled. We've covered some of history's most brutal rulers, but which end do you find the most ironic or the most just? And who did we miss? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. For more deep dives into history, click the video on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload from our channel.